Hi guys, thanks for joining us. I have my really good friend Landa here. I've had the pleasure of working with for the last 3 or 4 years. She's such a wealth of knowledge. She has a master's in special education with a focus on autism and developmental disabilities. She has 13 years of applied behavior analysis under her belt, as well as being a certified behavior analysis, and has a Category A Behaviour consultant, and she's on the RASP. We've like checked all the boxes here, my friend. And over the last little while, she's really noticed there's been a gap in what services that are offered. And I think what she has to share is really important because, first of all, sometimes we forget that the kids we're working with are really 13 and 14 because they're not functioning that high, and strict things are happening to their bodies. And they don't really understand why. And how do you explain that to a kid who's not functioning at 13 or 14? And then later in life, it leads to keeping them safe, keeping them aware so that people don't take advantage of them. So I think Landa has a really good niche that she's taking on here. So, I'll just let Landa take it from here.
Perfect. Thanks, Kat. Really appreciate you inviting me to kind of share what I'm up to with my new sort of specialized consultation business in town. So I did prepare a little PowerPoint to kind of help give people some visuals to follow along, and then I'll try and talk over it. So let's see if we can share the technology here, and we'll see what we can do. So I'm going to do a little.
Yay!
Can you see it? Okay, perfect.
Yep.
So like Kat said, my name's Landa. I have a master's in special ed and I'm a BCBA, and my consulting company is called Positive Connections, and my sub-tagline is supporting sexual health across the spectrum. Certainly looking to work with people with any sort of unique learning needs when it comes to promoting positive sexual health education from birth until the end of the lifespan. So really looking at sexual health and sexuality and how we can support that in learners of all ages and all abilities. So I put a little bit of information here. I have a website, positiveconnections.ca, where people can learn a little bit more about me, about the services that I offer. I'm hoping to add a little bit more detail on there shortly about different workshops that I am able to offer and different topics that I can talk about. But really my specialization is teaching sexual health education to individuals with unique learning needs. And that could be one-to-one or in small groups. Unfortunately, lots of kiddos that people like Kat and I might support can be excluded from some elements of education, and that could include sexual health education as well, either because there's an assumption that the kids don't need that information, it's too soon, or they can't learn it at the same rate as their peers. And so I really want to be able to be a resource that people can access to help their children learn some of those things outside of maybe a traditional teaching environment. And also providing information sessions and workshops to families, guardians, community groups who support people with unique learning needs. And that can cover a variety of topics as well. And I'll talk a bit about some of the things that I have done and that I hope to do in the future. Trying to keep up that active social media presence, which can be a bit challenging, but I do have Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, so you can connect with me at Positive Connections on Instagram. Twitter, lots of Twitter handles are taken, so I'm pause_con_can on Twitter, and Facebook, Positive Connections Canada is how you can look me up on Facebook. And again, trying to post some content there on a fairly regular basis and sharing other things that I hear about and I learn about that people might find helpful or relevant when it comes to teaching sexual health. So I kind of wanted to just share quickly kind of my thoughts on what is sexuality and sexual health, because I think a lot of people think that it's just about teaching about sex, like the physical act of sex, but I just wanted to share that I think it's important to acknowledge that it does include some biology, but also our kind of knowledge, our attitudes, our values, and our behaviors are all part of sexuality and sexual health education. That includes things like our identity, our orientation, and gender roles. And those are things that are important for us as caregivers and families and support staff. And those are also things that are going to be important for the people in our lives that we help to support, helping them understand things about their identity, their orientation, their gender roles. And also acknowledging that it's shaped by our culture, our history, our own education and experience. You know, what were the ways that you learned about sexuality or sexual health when you were growing up? Are those the ways that you want your children to learn? Do you want them to learn differently? Do you want them to learn the same? Are there religious values in your family that are really important for you to include in lessons about sexual health and sexual health education? And how can we work together to make sure that all of that is part of the teaching that we do? And definitely including the assumption that all people are sexual in a really broad sense and have some level of sexual expression. And that could range from very little sexual expression to a very healthy sexual expression. But just kind of making that underlying assumption that this is knowledge that everybody should have, because we're all sexual in a really broad, neat sense of the word. And I just wanted to share this position statement on sexuality and people with disabilities that I think is important. And just highlighting a few parts of it. I don't need to read it in detail for everybody, but it informs my practice, and that I think that having access to sexual health education and knowledge about sexuality is super important for everybody. And people with disabilities, whether that's a developmental disability or a physical disability, should also share that fundamental human right to knowledge about sexuality, because it's a fundamental part of who we are as people. And also being provided with opportunities to have sexual expression that are safe and protected and match with the values of an individual person and that person's family, or wherever their kind of current living situation might be. And that people that work with people with developmental disabilities or unique learning needs should have some training and understanding to support sexual development and behavior. And that's kind of where I wanted to come in as somebody who can provide that type of support to people. And I think that another important thing that I like to share is just a historical perspective on sexual health and sexual health education. And access to that for people with disabilities, because unfortunately, over time, and there's a lot of history related to sexual health education for everybody that has a lot of stigma attached to it, and that's particularly pronounced for people with developmental disabilities. The thinking is that they were either asexual, which means there's no sexuality, no interest in sexuality, no interest in establishing relationships with other people. But I think anybody who's worked with anybody with a developmental disability knows that they really are seeking out that sort of same interaction with other people. And that could be definitely not sexual at all, but that might turn into, as people age and become more mature, some level of interest in something that might be in the realm of sexual health. And also thinking that people need to be protected and childlike. And certainly we do need to look at making sure that people are safe and protected, but knowledge is power. And we say that a lot about a lot of different things, but unfortunately we don't think about knowledge as power when it comes to sexual health very often. And then the other end of that, people being seen as hypersexual. So there'd be like an uncontrollable sexual expression, that we need to protect other people, or that sexual behavior is deviant in some way. And that's not a helpful way to look at it. Just like any behavior that we engage in, there's a reason for it. We need to really look and see and understand that. And how can we help people express that in a way that's safe and healthy and matches with the values that they have as an individual and the people that are most close to them. So there's this whole area in the middle that I think we've forgotten about, and I hope to kind of bring people from those extremes into that middle piece and just sort of understand that we need to provide information so that we can make everybody more safe and more healthy when it comes to sexual health. So just sort of ideas about how that's impacted people. People with disabilities, like I said before, often excluded from sexual health education. I don't think that that ever comes with a sort of malicious intent. I think it comes usually from a place of caring from education providers. But how can I, as a service provider, help to make sure that people get the lessons that they need for their life right now? And also that it's focused a lot on abuse or abduction prevention. And like Kat said at the beginning in the introduction, we do need to make sure that we're helping to protect people from abuse and abduction. But those things start with really basic sexual health knowledge. You're way less likely to be a victim of sexual abuse if you have trusted, caring adults around you that you talk to in whatever way that you do communicate with the adults around you. And if you know, say, like the proper scientific names for your body parts, which is something that, you know, kids start learning at birth to age 2 and is in the kindergarten curriculum now in BC to learn the scientific names for body parts. So if we're teaching those things in a really concrete, meaningful way for the kids we're working with, that's a really good first step for preventing abuse. Or sometimes it was focused just on personal hygiene. So when something happens, particularly around puberty, like menstruation, we focus just on that and just on the hygiene part and not on all the other things that might happen for somebody. It could also be reactive, and that's something I want to switch is sort of getting people talking about these things and what is a typical sexual development for anybody, and how can we sort of start preparing the folks that we work with for those things so that they know that these changes are coming. They know that their body's going to change. They better learn how to use that 5-point scale when they're young, because when puberty hits, so you're gonna probably have more 5s than you did when the kiddo was 2. So making sure that we're trying to be as proactive as possible. And also looking at making sure that we're trying to stay away from shame or fear-based information. So not scaring people about their bodies, because if we send the message that your body is something scary that you shouldn't talk about, that's something else that can really hamper a person's ability to communicate if they have been a victim of any sort of abuse or they feel uncomfortable in a situation. So if we talk to the kids that we're working with about their bodies, or you're talking to a child that you have about their body, making sure that it's a positive interaction. And something that I want to do is be able to kind of coach parents about ways that they can have those conversations with their kids, how to modify those conversations with your kids so that your child is presented with that information in a way that they can understand. And so if sex ed was offered at all, it was kind of delayed or reactive. And I want in my practice to make sure that there's a resource people can go to if they start thinking about these things. As soon as you start thinking about it, that's a perfect time to start doing something about it. So there's no such thing as too late. If you feel like you missed the boat because your child already started puberty, that's okay. That's a good time to start teaching. It's never too late, and it's never too early. It's always the right time when you and your family, the kids that you're working with, are ready. So just a tiny bit more about how I hope to help. So individualized support for learning, small group instruction where that's appropriate, depending on the level of the learners and their ability to participate in a group lesson, their ability to participate with materials that might work for a variety of people, or, sibling groups potentially where there's kind of a family that wants to have information given to all of their kids, whether or not they have unique learning needs at all. I get just as many requests from friends of mine that have kids that they want me to come over to their house on Thursday night and talk to their kids about sexual health or give them the talk. And people need support, right? People with kids that don't have a designation, don't have a label, they want help too. So it's hard to reach out and say that you feel like you need somebody to talk to your child or help you talk to your child about something that's so personal. But I hope to be kind of like an open resource for people to make them feel more comfortable. And so workshops and trainings for families, parents, guardians. Again, that could be individualized in your living room on a Thursday night after the kids go to bed to talk about how you can have the talk. Or it could be a parent group that get together and kind of say, oh, all of our kids are going to, be in the puberty and soon, and having those mads, glads, and sads, and we could use a kind of a quick chat about how we can help our kids with that. Also workshops and training for support staff, so autism service providers, agencies, government organizations, school staff, making connections with other sexual health education providers in town, like the great educators at Island Sexual Health, and making sure that they know that I'm available as a resource as well if there's specialized services that people are asking for. And something that I'm also looking forward to doing and is working with some self-advocates in my practice at some point. Obviously, sex and sexual health is a topic that a lot of people have difficulty talking about. There are some really good self-advocates out there. Mary and Jerry Newport are a really famous example. They have a book that they've written. They're a couple married, and they both identify as having Asperger's, and they've written a book about their experiences with sexual health. And so working with people like that, or people that are on the spectrum, so that I can work with them and get their perspective, but also recognizing that it is a topic that a lot of people aren't super comfortable with sharing. So that's something I want to work towards as I establish more relationships with people in the community through this work. I'd also really like to get into the creation of individualized resources, so finding people that can create specific drawings, and if a family needs a specific, say, like story-based intervention to help teach a routine, creating really individualized resources for people. But then also having content available online through my website that could be some just sort of general resources with instructions on how to modify them based on sort of the age and the challenge that you're looking at. So if it is, teaching somebody about menstruation, what's a general resource, and here are some tips for how you can modify that resource. Maybe purchase or get that resource from me in a format that is easily modifiable, like insert your own pictures of your own bathroom and those kinds of things. So all big ideas that I have that I want to do. And then also offering just kind of brief workshops or video tutorials through my website or YouTube channels, those kinds of things, talking about, how to start the talk or the talks with somebody that you help support, whether that's a child or if you're a service provider, somebody that you work with. Okay. Wrong topic on the top of my slide there. But just to give people an idea of like the different topics, so sexual development, I think it's really important that people that are supporting kids, and that means parents and that means service providers, understand what typical sexual development is. I think where there's like a sense of people sometimes panicking about whether or not a behavior is normal or that it requires an intervention right away. But things like kids, touching their own genitals or kind of playing doctor and those kinds of things are totally normal behaviors that every child does. It's also normal if you don't do those behaviors, but those are things that don't need to lead to sort of a panic moment from a parent, and I think have a lot of those historical ties from them. But we really want to make sure that people are understanding a typical sexual development for people. Puberty is obviously a big one, a change that everybody goes through, and a change that, like Kat said at the beginning, is kind of going to happen regardless of where that person is in terms of their learning about some of the things that are happening to their body. Hormones are a fact of life. Also safe and healthy relationship choices for when people are getting a little bit older and entering possibly into that, and navigating making healthy relationships, establishing what is a friendship versus what is a romantic relationship, and how to differentiate between those things, and using some programs, things like circles of friends and that, and expanding that to relationships. And obviously, I think we've all seen that consent and talking about consent in our culture is a huge topic right now. It's certainly not black and white. I'm putting together a hour-long topic about consent right now, and that's a bit of a challenge to squeeze all that information in, but how can we start talking about some of those things early? And another thing especially for parents and service providers, is just how to answer questions about sexuality when your child asks, where did they come from? How do you start answering that question? If they want to know why somebody has body parts that look different than theirs, how do you start to answer that question? And providing people with some opportunities to practice and be comfortable answering those questions. How to help with having the talk, and maybe help with actually having the talk or the talks, right? Trying to make it an ongoing conversation. And direct service work as well. It is possible that any individual, but particularly people on the autism spectrum that may not be aware of some of the social norms that the rest of us kind of follow when it comes to expressions of sexual behavior, that then result in interfering with daily participation. So whether that's accessing community spaces or accessing spaces in an education environment, it is possible that those behaviors could arise. So part of my work too is addressing those behaviors that do become a bit of a concern, and how can we help that person find alternative behaviors. Learn about the difference between public and private is a big one. Lots of folks that people like Kat and I support, and that people are parents of, might not know the difference between public and private, and might not have a lot of opportunity for privacy if they share a bedroom with a sibling and they need somebody to help them with the bathroom routine and they need somebody to help them in the change room at the pool. The concept of privacy can be tough to understand when you don't get a lot of it. And so helping families and individuals navigate that. And then just building the skills needed for healthy sexual development. So things like from the basics of identifying and being able to name in using whatever language you have, your private body parts, all the way up to how to protect yourself in a community situation and identify people that are friends and people that maybe aren't friends for you. Yeah, that's the basics of Positive Connections and what I hope to do.
Well, thank you so much, Landa, for taking the time to share all this wonderful information and for following this really big need, because I think it's so important that parents and kids are informed, because that's a scary question when your kid comes up and says, "Where'd I come from? You mean the stork didn't deliver me?" Right. Like, that's kind of awkward. Yeah. Or like when a kid comes and asks me about why my coworker ate her kid and why she's in her tummy. Right. Yeah. Like that's how things get there, right? Mm-hmm. Things get in your tummy by eating it. So why'd you eat your kid? Right. Yeah. And these things are confusing. Is it going to come out with spaghetti on top? That's right. Like. Yeah. So I will make sure that this gets up on my Facebook page. I'll also put your Facebook link underneath, and then if you want to send me your link to the website, I'll also put that up there. That'd be great, Kat. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. And appreciate what you're doing with trying to share things through your website as well.